War is an expensive business at the best of times, but Russia's war with Ukraine has been one of the most costly conflicts in recent history. The Russian government has poured hundreds of billions of dollars into its invasion so far, and the longer the fighting goes on, the more unsustainable it becomes. Bit by bit, Vladimir Putin's war machine is bleeding Russia dry, and the country's economy is in a rapid freefall state, approaching a recession at a breakneck pace. Back in the early stages of the war, the Kremlin had cushions to fall back on when its economy started to feel the strain. It had spent several years leading up to the 2022 invasion, anticipating the sorts of sanctions and financial difficulties it might face once the war began. And it found ways to preempt them, like minimizing its external debt, reducing its reliance on Western technologies and other resources, and amassing its national wealth fund, or Putin's war chest as it has since come to be known. It started to strengthen important trading relationships with countries like India and China too, confident that they would continue to invest heavily in Russian fuel and other resources regardless of what happened in Ukraine. Thanks to this, even when wave after wave of Western sanctions hit Russia in 2022 and 2023, the country's economy remained relatively stable, and Putin proudly boasted, "The Russian economy and management system turned out to be much stronger than the West believed." However, as more time has passed, sanctions have started to take a real toll, and Putin's reckless defense spending is, in effect, digging the country into an increasingly deep hole, one which it may struggle to ever escape from. Now, the Russian leader finds himself stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, the more money Putin pours into the war, the more his country's economy will weaken from within. On the other hand, even if the Russian president went in the other direction and massively slashed spending for defense and security, his country would likely face a recession anyway. According to expert economists, there's no viable way out of this situation, no way for Putin to win. Instead, he has to simply decide on whichever path he feels would be the least destructive, or whichever one stands to benefit him the most on a personal level. That may explain why the Russian government announced plans to spend a staggering 38% of its federal budget on military and security apparatus for 2026. This is an unprecedented level of military spending, and there are few countries, if any, anywhere in the world that would be willing to spend such a staggering amount of their budgets purely on warfare, leaving relatively little left over for the countless other costs involved in running a country. Russia, however, seems to feel it's the right way forward, with the government submitting a draft 2026-28 budget to the State Duma, including 12.9 trillion rubles, approximately $159 billion, being set aside to fund the war in Ukraine in 2026 alone. This is in fact a very slight reduction. A 4.4% reduction to be precise when compared to 2025's reported numbers. Thanks to this, Putin is effectively able to say that he kept the promise he made in June 2025 when he announced, "We're planning to cut defense spending, and we're planning for next year and the year after that and for the next 3 years." However, such a tiny reduction is not what many people would have had in mind when the Russian president initially spoke about budget cuts. Plus, when the 12.9 trillion rubles for defense is added to with extra costs related to the army, police, and secret services, Russia will ultimately spend an estimated 16.84 trillion rubles, or $207 billion. What's more, it wouldn't be surprising if Russia's real-world spending ended up exceeding that figure. In fact, it's highly likely. An insider source with knowledge of the budget process revealed to Reuters that Russia's actual military spending regularly exceeds stated targets, with additional expenditure sometimes concealed from the public. Looking back over 2025, for example, Russia's official defense spending figures are classified, so the public and the wider world will never know exactly how much the country invested into its invasion. But we do know from published materials that extra funds were allocated to the war effort. 30 billion rubles, for instance, were provided in capital for PSB, one of the big banks that serves Russia's military-industrial complex. It's almost guaranteed that similar instances will be recorded and eventually revealed again in 2026, 2027, and for however long the war rages on. It also wouldn't be much of a shock if Russia decided to suddenly adjust its spending at some stage, with another source telling Reuters, if there is active warfare, they can add funding at any moment. Intended spending for 2027 is also set to exceed 2025 levels, suggesting that the Russian government is ready to go all in on the war for as long as it feels necessary, no matter the cost. So how is Russia planning to cover all of these costs? Well, the country's finance ministry appears to have been hard at work at figuring out ways to plug the gaps in its economy while keeping defense investment as high as possible. In the end, it came to arguably the simplest and most obvious decision, increasing VAT to 22%, while also increasing a number of other taxes in order to essentially generate the added cash needed to fuel the war. In other words, it's everyday Russian people and businesses that are, once again, set to foot the bill for Putin's war with Ukraine. Even though the government has promised to stick to a lower VAT rate of 10% on essential items like food, medicine, and children's goods, the average Russian is inevitably going to lose money as a result of these decisions. Numerous economists have acknowledged that the VAT increase will almost surely slow down the economy, trigger a whole new wave of inflation, and lead to price hikes on the majority of goods and services people need to live their lives. At a time when life is already increasingly expensive and challenging for Russian families, this will only make things worse. Naturally, the Kremlin has done its best to downplay these negative effects, with Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov calling the new budget absolutely balanced and stating that the tax hikes were a completely normal process for a state at this stage of development. Peskov also followed the Kremlin playbook by reiterating the importance of winning the war. For the sake of our children and grandchildren, this is now the most acute stage of the war, and it will determine the future, hence our patriotism. But as they lose more money and their lives get harder, typical Russian people will become less inclined to agree with that particular definition of patriotism. And with polls showing that the vast majority of Russians are increasingly eager to see a peaceful end to the war rather than continued fighting, it's likely that Putin's popularity will continue to decline the longer the conflict continues. However, the Russian president may feel he has no other option, with one Russian economist, Vadim Baranov, stating that the Kremlin had to publish a significant war budget as a way of showing the world that Russia hasn't changed its domestic or foreign policy priorities. In other words, it's a power play. In announcing that it intends to spend more and more money on this war for several years to come, Russia is telling the wider world that it has no intention to give up, wave a white flag, or sit down at the negotiating table anytime soon. It's ready to continue bombarding Ukraine, throwing colossal quantities of troops and armor over the border, and doing everything in its power to capture territory and achieve its aims. It will be up to Ukraine and its allies to respond accordingly, and Russia may hope that this decision sends ripples of fear and panic across Kyiv and beyond, perhaps even pressuring Ukraine to agree to cede its territories and sign a ceasefire deal that greatly favors Russia. In reality, however, that's highly unlikely to happen, and it's Russia that's more likely to end up in a much more dire and desperate situation as a result of its budgetary decisions. Back in June 2025 at the St. Petersburg International Economics Forum, numerous senior officials in the Russian bank and finance industry sounded the alarm, warning that Russia was facing a choice between either saving its economy or persisting with the war. In September 2025, German Gref, head of Russia's biggest bank, Sberbank, warned that economic growth was approaching zero and that the central bank had to act fast to avoid excessive cooling of the economy, stating, "It's crucial to emerge from the period of controlled economic cooling so that it does not turn into stagnation. It will be much more difficult to restart the economy than cool it down." Others agreed, and even the Russian Minister for Economic Development, Maxim Reshetnikov, shared his fear that the country was teetering on the brink of recession. Well, if it was a straightforward choice between persisting with the war or protecting the economy, that choice has clearly been made. Putin has picked war, and he'll have to live with the consequences, and those consequences are set to be extremely severe. As mentioned previously, the Russian economy actually managed to cope quite well in the first couple of years of the war, thanks to the proactive efforts the country had made leading up to the invasion to prepare itself. It funneled cash from state coffers into the military-industrial complex and relied on strong trade relationships with the likes of China and India to keep its all-important oil industry flowing smoothly, even as Western nations imposed sanctions and cut ties with Russian banks and businesses. But that momentum slowly started to wane, and from early 2025 onwards, several crises began to strike in numerous sectors, such as construction, mining, and transport. Even the oil industry, which has for so long provided the firm and stable foundations on which the entire Russian economy is built, accounting for around 1/5 of the country's total budget revenue, has begun to suffer. Oil production rates and revenue have dramatically declined in recent times, and with Ukraine launching a continuous coordinated series of strategic strikes on oil infrastructure like pipelines and refineries, it's only going to get worse before it has any chance of getting better. On top of this, 3 additional factors mean that Russia's economy is set to stagnate for the foreseeable future. First, there's the effect of Western sanctions. While these didn't necessarily make the biggest impact early on in the war, the many waves of sanctions that have followed over the years have taken a toll as time has gone by. They've isolated Russian banks and businesses from large parts of the world, making imports more expensive and exports harder to achieve. These sanctions are set to continue, with the European Union and other nations already working on future waves, exploring new ways to punish and penalize Russian oligarchs, banks, and government officials. The second big factor is the labor shortage. Russia is dealing with dramatic shortages across all major sectors of the economy, due in part to the colossal number of workers who have been mobilized or recruited for the war effort, plus the estimated 1 million Russians who have left the country since the war began. Many of those that left include some of Russia's brightest young minds, including countless college-educated individuals who have contributed greatly to the country's economy but are now instead making lives for themselves in other nations around the world. Tens of thousands more Russians are recruited and dispatched to the front lines each month, with a large number of them unlikely to ever return home. The longer this goes on, the fewer people there will actually be in Russia to work the various jobs needed to keep the economy and its various core sectors going. There'll be fewer farmers, miners, construction workers, truck drivers, logistics operators, and so on. And if businesses can't find trained, experienced people to do the work that needs doing, then many of them will inevitably be forced to fold. The third and final factor negatively impacting Russia's economy both now and for the foreseeable future is the high inflation rate. Fueled by the Kremlin's excessive military expenditure, inflation is soaring in Russia. The central bank has taken steps to calm the situation by increasing interest rates, but in the economy every action has consequences, and with interest rates reaching record levels, borrowing is now almost impossible for Russian people and even most businesses outside of the military-industrial complex. With fewer Russians able to take out loans, mortgages, and lines of credit, spending drops, the economy weakens further, and people's quality of life descends even lower. The Kremlin's latest budget won't fix any of these 3 issues in 2026, and it's likely they'll all last much longer than that as well. Interest rates will continue to remain high, and tax rises will stifle civilian industries, according to Alina Rybakova, senior researcher at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. At the same time, so many Russians are now economically reliant on the military-industrial complex. So, even if the Kremlin made a concerted effort to cut state funding to the defense sector in an attempt to bring about an end to the war, then that decision too would lead to unimaginable crises. Economists have compared the current situation to the global financial crisis of 2008, when the real estate bubble in the US swelled to such a size that it eventually collapsed in on itself, triggering economic disaster around the world. In Russia, rather than the real estate market, it's the military-industrial complex that's soaking up funds and resources at ridiculous levels. Countless workers have been swept up into the industry, leaving so many other civilian sectors understaffed and under-resourced. Rybakova and others warn that the military-industrial complex will, therefore, need to be reined in at some stage. But whenever that happens, a recession will almost inevitably follow. This was confirmed by Alexander Kuzmin, who heads up a Russian economic center. He described the current economic climate as a kind of catch-22 situation, adding that it's difficult to get out of and unclear how to manage, since Russia is now reliant on the military-industrial complex to survive, but that same complex is eating up its economy from the inside. There's no way out, no clear path or plan that will lead to some sort of balanced and manageable outcome. No matter what Russia decides to do, disaster will ensue and recession is inevitable. And when it comes, the recession will bring even graver issues for the Kremlin to contend with, like further cuts to production and profits, rising rates of unemployment, and wage cuts across the board. On an even deeper level, the Russian people would find themselves even weaker and poorer than they could ever imagined, and many will easily see the links between the war and their worsening situation, placing the blame for their problems squarely at the feet of President Putin. This is something that experts have been predicting for a long time. Ever since the war began, there's been talk of an imminent or inevitable Russian recession, but many analysts expected it would come as a result of sanctions and the freezing of foreign assets. In other words, they expected the West to effectively force a recession onto Russia. Instead, when the recession occurs, it will actually be more a creation of the Kremlin itself, a direct and inescapable consequence of Putin's recklessness, hubris, and misjudgments. There's little doubt now that the recession will come. The only questions left are when it will occur and how bad it will be. That, Rybakova says, also depends on the Kremlin. The more money it pumps into the defense complex, the bigger the bubble will get and the worse the effects will eventually be. At the same time, continuing to invest in the military is the one option left to stave off the recession a little while longer. Again, this echoes the catch-22 situation spoken about by Kuzmin, stuck in a hole with no way out. Russia's only plan is to keep on digging. The only other way the situation might be slightly less dramatic for the Kremlin is if it were able to ease some of the sanctions imposed upon it. If it were to achieve that, Baranov argues, the Kremlin could extricate itself from the current situation a little more easily, as it'll be able to recommence trade with various nations around the world, improving exports and importing necessary goods and services too. With more money flowing into the country from other nations, the pressure on various sectors may be eased. But to achieve that, the Kremlin would have to agree to some sort of ceasefire or peaceful end to the war that works for all parties. So far, it's shown almost zero interest in that, with Putin and other Kremlin officials rejecting any and all chances to sit down with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and other world leaders to hash out the details of a realistic peace agreement. And so the war continues, and Russia's free-falling economy slips ever closer to complete and utter chaos. Now, you can learn more about how a weakening economy and minimal progress along the front lines is weakening Putin's grip on power in this video, looking at how, after 2.5 decades in charge, the Russian president is facing his biggest challenge yet. Or check out this video to see how even some of Putin's closest allies and biggest supporters have started to turn on him, with one Russian state TV host admitting that Ukraine will never fall. And finally, make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications too, so you can be among the first in the world to find out about the latest big news and important developments from the Russia-Ukraine war and other significant conflicts worldwide.